topic. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about healing with books, and tonight we have Mary Mahoney. Take it away, Mary.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. And thanks to Sarah and everyone at the Bloomfield Public Library for inviting me to share this virtual space and kind of take you through some of what I work on as a historian, but also I know to be true as a reader myself in my own life, and that's that books can heal. So tonight, what I'm hoping to do is introduce you to some stories in what I'll call the history of bibliotherapy, which is the use of books as medicine, and also offer reflection points along the way for everyone to kind of think through their own lives as readers and how you might use books to heal in your own life. And hopefully spark some ideas maybe for different ways of interacting with reading, in your own life as we move through the summer in a kind of stressful time. Before I get started, I just want to say, if you have any questions throughout my presentation, feel free to put them in the chat if you're afraid you'll forget them, or just hold on to them till the end of the talk. And then I'll be very happy to answer your questions, especially when we stopped recording, just to kind of protect everyone's privacy. Looking forward to a great conversation. And I also want to share a link to my slides so that you can kind of click through them with me. And I'll also share my screen now so that you can see my slides as we get started here. One moment. All right, so hopefully now you're seeing my screen and we've started the slideshow. Okay, great. So hopefully you're seeing the first slide here. All right, so I wonder how many of you have actually heard the word bibliotherapy, which is a term developed in the 20th century for the use of books as medicine. Tonight, I want to think about the mystery of the use of books as medicine, how it works, who gets to decide what books make the best medicine, what do books treat, or reading in general, what can reading treat or heal, and who gets to decide. I also think it's really important to consider bibliotherapy in our own current moment. I asked the librarians, Sarah and others at Bloomfield, to kind of help me reflect on what specifically about bibliotherapy I might bring into this conversation. And I think it was Sarah's colleague who offered some reflecting questions. I just want to read them briefly. How do we heal from the current news in this country, whether it's racism, trauma, inflation, war, loss of women's rights, destruction of our climate? How do we stay informed so as not to be ignorant, but also allow ourselves to recharge to have the energy to fight? So these questions are ones I've been reflecting on a lot and preparing for this evening, and they point to the many sources of anxiety and stress in our world. It feels like a really stressful time all the time, it seems like these days. But it also reveals something about the role reading can play in our lives and our health in particular. Because reading is the means by which we often stay up to date on issues, whether we're reading the newspaper. I actually still read a physical newspaper some days, or doom scrolling online at night when you should probably be away from your phone. But it can also be an act that can offer therapeutic support in dealing with these very real hardships in life. So how can we keep from only exposing ourselves to harm or sources of stress or trauma or frustration? How can we approach reading therapeutically to support our own well-being, to heal both ourselves and support restorative work in our world? Tonight, to try to cover some of this, it's a huge topic, but I just want to kind of take us through some examples, both from the past and the present of this work in our world. And I want to focus especially on 3 different types of healing reading. And that's reading to escape, self-help books or reading, and reading to develop a sense of ourselves or our own identities. Now, along the way, I'll be asking some reflective questions, and I hope that they invite you to kind of think about your own life as a reader, and we can discuss kind of what comes up for you at the end of our conversation. First, before I go any further, I want to talk about the word bibliotherapy itself. I don't know if any of you had actually heard that word or encountered it in life before this evening, but it's a word that has a kind of a strange history. It's a word that's now used to describe a very real practice using books to heal, but it was actually invented as an absurdist kind of short story. It was invented as a joke, and people who decided to adopt this word for their very serious work often had no idea that it was actually pulled from a short story published in 1914 in the Atlantic, that imagined a minister going to an abandoned church that had been repurposed by a physician as a bibliotherapeutic clinic. And the doctor was kind of prescribing novels to people with depression or who had common colds. And the story was meant to kind of be an absurdist moment in 1914 when people were turning away from religion as a source of comfort or strength and towards things like popular literature. So even though it was kind of a playful story, that word was invented as sort of a joke. And it's only a few years after that that it was adopted by librarians and doctors as a real word for this real work that they decided, the real field that they tried to create. Before we get to that moment in the history, I do want to take us back to some of the first attempts to use bibliotherapy or to use books to heal in a medical setting. And in order to do that, we're going to go together to 1800, to early mental hospitals, which were called then retreats or asylums, which presented themselves as spaces for moral treatment. And you can see here a picture. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. Libraries as calming spaces here. So this is the Friends Retreat in Pennsylvania. And you can see on the left here, that's a photo of its library. And to get a sense of the context of it, you can see it in an 18th or 19th century illustration from one of its annual reports here on the right. And you can see that it's designed to be situated in a beautiful setting. Like this is a gorgeous scene here from this, from their own literature. And this was in keeping with how mental health was treated at these reformed asylums. So mental health was, this was a moment of when moral treatment was developed to treat mental illness, which was a pivot away from earlier treatments, which are mostly reminiscent of kind of carceral settings. Moral treatment believed that you should treat patients with kindness and offered various forms of occupation in a calming environment. It was believed that the mentally ill would be cared for until reason returned. This was a process that was little understood. It was very difficult to define for physicians to define insanity in this period in terms of its cause or even its treatment. But they thought if there was kind of calming environments and forms of occupation, it would kind of pacify patients until reason might return. So this is why if you drive around and you see former mental hospitals that have very symmetrical architecture, that's why they're so symmetrical. It was believed that architecture itself could be therapeutic. And in these spaces, reading was thought a safe form of recreation. It could occupy patients' time while also offering a safe retreat from the world and thoughts of their illness. In this period, hypochondria was a very real concern, and doctors were really nervous that the mentally ill in particular would be drawn to focus on their own health complaints and that would actually make their mental illness much worse. So for them, reading as a form of escape was actually of vital therapeutic importance. But they didn't prescribe the kinds of escape that we might think of, first of all. So if you think about your own life as a reader, when you want to escape from something in your life, you know, the craziness of the world, whatever, you know, think about the genres that most appeal to you. Maybe it's a romance novel, maybe it's an adventure book, comic book, whatever. In an asylum in this period, you might actually be handed, and this is my personal nightmare, a math textbook, because it was believed that the best medicine, the best literary medicine was one that really focused your attention. So a math problem would really focus someone's attention on the problem just in front of them and maybe draw their attention away from their own health complaints. In this same period and in these spaces, physicians also prescribed travel books and history books for similar reasons, that it was a safe form of occupation, it would distract you, it would offer an inviting form of escape, while also offering a useful source of education. And so, you know, if we could educate patients while they're in asylums, you know, so much the better, or so people in these spaces believed. And I should note that what's now the Institute of Living in Hartford was formerly the Hartford Retreat in this same period in the 1820s. So they were very actively prescribing books as medicine in that space. And in some spaces, physicians were allowed, or patients were allowed to choose their own books among these kind of safe genres that were prescribed. But in some cases, doctors were literally prescribing books just as they prescribed medication, which I think in some ways is hard for us to imagine now. But here's a quote from a doctor who was touring the Crichton Institute in Scotland, who wrote, "Collections of books were contemporary with the laboratory. The medical officers invariably carried a catalog along with a prescription book in their daily medical visits to every patient." And it's sort of interesting to think or imagine physicians literally having a prescription pad in one hand and the library catalog in the other, and viewing both as beneficial to treating a patient. And we'll kind of want to remember that for kind of work that's happening now in bibliotherapy. We'll see how there's been a return to that kind of image or practice. But just in the same way that books could be medicine, they also believed that books could pose a real danger if they were wrongly prescribed. So just as I was saying before that, books reading in our own lives can be a source of anxiety, like if you're using it to read stuff on your phone at night that's stressful, it also can be a form of therapeutic practice. That's how these physicians were also thinking about reading. So in the same space that they're prescribing it as medicine, they're also literally prescribing or diagnosing forms of insanity based on people's reading choices. And I have an example here from actually the Connecticut Retreat for the Insane, which is now the Institute of Living. Now, I apologize, this picture is a little bit blurry, but if you can look in the bar that I've highlighted there, you'll see that this is from the annual report of 1828. And you can see that there is a female patient, 41 years old. She has a form of insanity they call mania imbecilis. And you can see the supposed remote and exciting causes, because again, they thought even as they couldn't define insanity or necessarily articulate its cause, they sort of imagined that there were, in some cases, moral or cultural causes that contributed to it. And in her case, it was predisposition excited by novel reading. Now, I don't know if any of you here love to read fiction. I know that I do. I can't imagine my taste in reading being used to contribute or just articulated as an actual medical diagnosis, as a sign of what's called mental illness. But it's interesting to kind of consider why that might be. Why would women's reading of novels be considered so dangerous in this time period, and really for most of the 19th century? And part of that is because our lives, our reading lives, offer us a space to imagine our own identities. And I'll get into more of identity formation in a moment, but readings are a space. Reading is, there are no boundaries. You can go anywhere, you can do anything. And for women leading very prescribed lives, books were seen as a danger to people who didn't want them to go outside of those boundaries, right, of what was expected of them in their lives. And you can see this actual account in a newspaper, and this is not a one-off account. These kind of reports in newspapers across the country were frequent, of a woman, in this case named Mary Abbott, 16-year-old girl residing in San Joaquin Valley, California, who's become insane from reading dime novels. Her mania is a desire to become a cowboy. Now, dime novels, we don't have that term really used that much these days anymore, but it's really like cheap paperbacks, like what you would buy at a CVS per se. So these were denigrated as sort of like trashy novels. And this girl is reading them and using them to imagine a life that's completely outside the bounds of what was expected of her, or many women in this moment. So just as reading was essential to kind of focus people's attention on things that were considered morally safe, like sources of education or history books, reading could also cause disease in this moment. So that dual fear, but also belief in the power of books to heal, is something that I want us to keep in mind as we kind of walk through other moments, because that's really still in our world today. But I kind of want to pause here and offer a reflection question for everyone with us this evening to think about your own life as a reader. So even just thinking about your life during COVID-19, have you ever picked up a mystery or watched something light on TV to escape the news? Asylum physicians, as I noted, thought it was a danger to focus too much on oneself or on the source of your illness. When you're confronting a challenge in life as well, like, COVID-19 or something else, do you naturally want to seek out reading that reminds you of it or takes you away from it? So is escape something that you engage in your own maybe kind of like self-treatment as a bibliotherapist? Is that something that you gravitate towards? And maybe just reflect, what direction your escape takes and think about why that might be. What is it doing for you? What work is it doing for you? Or are you the kind of person who finds some kind of comfort or community in reading more about the situation that you find yourself in? Just something to kind of reflect on as we move through kind of another historical period together. So reading offered escape for a lot of folks in this time period that we were in. But in this period still, there's not a widespread effort to make bibliotherapy or reading a form of actual practiced medicine. It's really just inside these mental health hospitals. It hasn't really expanded to be something applied to the general population. And the moment when that really changes is World War I. And the reason why is because a lot of the librarians who actually worked in mental health hospitals in 1917, when the United States entered World War I, a lot of them actually resigned their positions and decided to sign up or enlist with what was called the Library War Service. And this was a nationwide effort funded by a lot of nonprofit organizations, but led by the ALA, to collect donated books and send them overseas and to bases on the home front for soldiers, both for recreational purposes and also for educational purposes, because everyone who was enlisted, most people had no military experience, and they actually wanted to read books about how to shoot guns. Like, this is an actual thing that happened. They wanted to read about the nations involved in the war itself, because a lot of folks who were enlisted had very little understanding of what the war was actually about. So this dual reason to have books for education, for entertainment, was the original purpose of this service. But once soldiers actually saw action in the war, the mission of this service completely changed. And it became about rehabilitation and healing with reading. And there was actually something called the Hospital Library Service. And it was the only branch of this entire Library War Service that would only employ women librarians. And this was because of a gendered belief in the time that women were better caretakers. So this is why, like, nurses often get gendered as female in this period, and still now in many cases. So you can see before you one of these hospital librarians, and they made their own uniforms because they wanted to be taken seriously as professionals. They wanted to walk through a hospital and prescribe books and be taken just as seriously in that work as a nurse prescribing medicine or administering medicine, or a doctor prescribing medicine or articulating a diagnosis. So you can see her there on the far right. She has a patch on her arm that says Hospital Library Service, and she's there with nurses and with soldiers recuperating. And she's actually wheeling from patient to patient. She would go from bedside to bedside with this book cart. Now, you may have seen a book cart in a library, maybe a public library or a school library, but they were actually developed in hospitals for treating convalescent patients. So librarians stationed themselves in all kinds of hospitals during the war, not just mental hospitals, but orthopedic, tubercular, general. And they really thought that if they could put together a system that matched different genres to different diseases, they could use the war to jumpstart a brand new field of medicine called bibliotherapy. And one of the librarians wrote, "I believe there will be a Department of Bibliotherapy in every hospital." That's how ardently they believed this was going to happen. Now, spoiler alert, if any of you have ever had the unfortunate need to go to a hospital, you probably know there isn't a Department of Bibliotherapy in most hospitals, but there are departments for other specialties that really got their start in the war, like occupational therapy, dietitians, nutritionists. So we can get into what happened with these folks, why this didn't happen. But I really just want to focus on how they used escape when they were prescribing from book carts like this. So they ardently believed that no one should be given a book that reminded them of the war, because they too thought the best thing they could do for soldiers was take their minds away from it. But they also were shocked at the books that patients were requesting for themselves. The most popular genre of books among men in World War II were romance novels. Now, I don't know if anyone listening to this would expect that to be the case. I know when I first discovered this, I was surprised, just like the librarians in this period, because they wanted to be so professional. We know a lot of what they were thinking about reading because they left us a lot of articles they wrote and published in professional journals, trying to articulate how they thought a science of bibliotherapy might work. So they really believed that men should be given Westerns, they should be given books about adventure, toughness, nature, and travel books, history books, biographies. And then when they were mostly recuperated or ready to return home, they should start reading about maybe a potential professional path or field they might want to go into. So imagine their surprise when men instead are requesting a ton of romance novels. And one librarian in the period actually wrote an article about this where she said, I need to figure out what's going on. I can't make sense of this. And this was her theory. And I want to say that this is her theory, not mine. She made a point of saying, I believe that when men become sick, they turn into women. And this is sort of like actually a fascinating idea because you can see the mental gymnastics that she's doing to make sense of just wanting to read a romance novel. But she said, I believe that men become women when they're sick. And then it presents actually a sign of recovery that she could mark, which is, I know a man is getting better when he starts to ask me for Westerns. We might kind of, in our own gender politics today, none of this makes any sense. And of course, everyone should be allowed to read what they want. But this was really kind of the gender politics of the period. This made sense to her and to her peers. But it's interesting if we just try to imagine for ourselves, why would somebody serving overseas in a war zone find comfort in reading a romance novel? And I think part of the answer to that is romance novels often are set in domestic spaces. And I think from what we can read of men who read them, they were so beloved because they offered a really healthy form of escape for men serving overseas who had seen really traumatic things. They reminded them of home. And so homesickness is actually a huge issue for people serving overseas, and romance novels may have offered some kind of healing or therapeutic, effect for people dealing with that. But of course, that's not what the librarian thought was going on. It's also interesting to note that even when World War I was still happening, there were books being published about it. So there are histories of World War I that come out while the war was still going on. So it's kind of unclear what the ending probably read like. And all of those books were banned in hospital libraries where soldiers or veterans were recuperating, because again, it was believed it would take them to the site of their trauma or injury. And in fact, men got around this by ordering from a Sears catalog some of these books directly shipped to them in the hospital. And if we try to think about why that might happen, why that might be appealing, you might imagine that, this is maybe the most formative experience of your life. Maybe you want to know more about this thing of which you feel a part. It might kind of remind you of a sense of community that maybe you feel apart from in a hospital bed. So we can kind of think about these competing ideas of what books make the best medicine and kind of who should decide. I want to turn now to a wholly different kind of therapeutic or healing reading that a lot of us might take part in, and that's self-help reading. So we might think about this as kind of the precursor to kind of cognitive behavioral therapy or therapies where you're developing strategies to deal with issues in your life. So you're actively picking up a book because you want it to have some effect on you, and you're looking for instructions or like overt support for an illness or an issue in your life. When self-help began, it actually has a long history. It was used to treat all kinds of things. So not just, physical or mental complaints, but we might think about like financial tips you might get from a book, diet, love life, relationships, what have you. And the oldest self-help book actually dates back to 1859 by Samuel Smiles. It's called, imaginatively titled, Self-Help. It's still in publication today. So, a lot of these books have a lot of different motivations, but experts often believed that you could manifest things in your life just by reading them in a book. That was basically how self-help in its early stages started. And it's also kind of in conversation with the religion of Christian Science, which also begins around the same time and in the same place as a lot of the first self-help books, which were published in Boston. So I actually wanted, I don't know if people know this, but an early self-help book is actually the one that's in front of you right now on screen, The Little Engine That Could. I know I read this book when I was growing up. It's been in publication since 1930, but few people know that, it's an early self-help book, and you can tell because the author actually was motivated by the same technique that self-help books use that are aimed at adults, which is presenting mantras or sayings that you can say out loud to yourself that will help compel you to kind of face whatever the challenge is that's inspired you to pick up the book. So how many of us know the line, I think I can, which is probably the most famous part of this book. And that is directly a self-help tenet that, this person wrote into a book intended for children. And what's interesting is this was all based or written from a Massachusetts author. As I said, a lot of early self-help books were written in the Boston area when it was called Mind Cure, where the belief you could actually read something and it might even heal something in your physical body. There's a belief that you could read a certain book and it would put you to sleep if you had insomnia. I mean, we've probably read some books that do that unintentionally, but that's how much they believed self-help books could function using self-help. Some of you might be familiar with this book, The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale from 1952. He was a minister at Marble Collegiate Church in New York City. And while there, he invited a psychoanalyst to set up a clinic in the basement to treat patients in problems of everyday life using both therapy and religion and poetry. So this is where he actually is in some ways responsible for poetry therapy, which is using poetry to kind of address issues of everyday life. Interestingly, just as two trivial facts about this book and this person, this is the most read book in prisons in the United States, The Power of Positive Thinking. Second trivial piece is that Norman Vincent Peale was the minister of the Trump family. So Trump's own personal motives, or like he frequently draws inadvertently on self-help rhetoric, at least from Norman Vincent Peale's examples. I mentioned before that when we think about a doctor at an asylum in the Scotland Crichton Institute, walking through the hospital and having a prescription pad in one hand and the library catalog in the other, that there would be modern examples of that actually returning in our world today. And this is one of them. This is a modern program in the UK called Reading Well. And this program was originally designed to kind of help boost public library use in the UK, which was declining. So the theory was that you would go to your physician and you would maybe get a physical and you might say, I'm a little bit anxious with the state of the world, who isn't? And your physician would say, you know what, here's a literary prescription, take this to your local public library. And then they would be prepared to give you pamphlets on anxiety and point to books in their collection that might support you in kind of learning some self-help strategies for addressing anxiety in your life. So this program is still in existence. And actually now there's a kind of sister program in Australia. And there have been attempts to make programs like this in the United States, not as successfully as of yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we kind of see this developing in our own world in medical care. And you might reflect on, has there ever been a time when a doctor or a therapist has recommended a book to you? And, like what role did that have in treating the issue for which you were seeking treatment? Okay, so I focused a little bit on cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of books, self-help reading, where you're consciously seeking out books that might have strategies to help improve issues in your life. Now I want to kind of pivot a bit to some other forms of reading that work on identity. Before I get there, I will just mention a Connecticut-based example for folks who are interested. I mentioned that Reading Well hasn't really caught on here in the US yet, but public libraries are doing really amazing work on their own kind of independent programs. And some of these are in Connecticut. This is Meriden Public Library's thematic kits program. And you can see that for kids, they have all kinds of kits that are curated with materials to address certain topics or themes. So you can see that, you know, there's different ways of, without maybe a physician's prescription, being able to walk into your library and request support around specific topics. So that's really cool to see. And I'm sure folks can reach out and get specific kind of reader advisory from the great librarians at Bloomfield Public Library as well. Now I want to get into this kind of bibliotherapy that's the most mysterious. So if you're anxious and you go to your doctor and say, hey, I'm anxious, please help, and he sends you to the library, you can sort of guess that you might be handed a book about anxiety. That's not too surprising in terms of a form of treatment, that it would give you practical tips on how to maybe self-soothe and deal with anxiety. Identity bibliotherapy, or bibliotherapy that explicitly deals with self-development and questions of identity, is somewhat more mysterious. And this might be the kind of bibliotherapy that you've inadvertently experienced without even knowing it. So these are the moments when you find yourself reading a book and you don't even remember why you picked this book up, but you might just reach a line in a book and it just hits you where you live. And it completely speaks to something that's going on in your life. Maybe you haven't even told anyone about it. And it's just the thing you needed to read at that moment. And it helps maybe unlock something about yourself, for yourself. Maybe it's a calming phrase or a scene or a character. You know, my mom during the pandemic got really into reading Louise Penny mysteries, which are set in an imaginary Canadian town. My mom has spent almost zero time in Canada. And yet, and it's not really a line in those books that has comforted her. It's just this imaginary place popped up just at the moment when she needed that kind of comfort. And I know in my own life, you know, I stumbled on the poetry of Mary Oliver. I have no idea how I first found it, but some of her poems have been just the thing I needed to read at just the right moment in my life. So these are the kinds of kismet literary moments that can be really powerful for folks who are dealing with issues of identity. Now, I don't know if anyone here has ever read Joan Didion, but she's perhaps most famous in some ways for this line, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Now, there's two possible readings of this line. I think there's the wholesome version, which is what I'm going to go with, which is, you know, in any kind of situation, you can decide what kind of story or narrative you want to tell yourself about it to get through it or to kind of process it. Whereas what she was talking about is when people are delusional, they'll tell themselves anything in order to live. So that interpretation is not necessarily helpful to us here. But thinking about the ways that we can choose to reframe our own story or tell ourselves a different story about our experience is a main feature of this kind of bibliotherapy. And that is what I want to talk about. Now, few people know who Sadie Delaney is, but she's a hugely important person in the history of bibliotherapy and of librarianship. When most people think about Tuskegee, if you've ever heard that word, your mind probably goes to the horrific medical experimentation that took place in Tuskegee without the knowledge of its subjects for many years when they could have been treated with the development of penicillin and were not. So it's often associated with a traumatic medical history. But Sadie Delaney's work actually invites us to think about a really inspiring medical innovation at the same space. She was actually a librarian in Harlem in the New York Public Library system, and in the 1920s was recruited to start a pilot bibliotherapy program at the Veterans Hospital in Tuskegee, Alabama. While she was there for the length of her career until her death in 1956, she innovated so many experimental uses of how books can heal. She developed for patients who were bedridden, helping to project books on the ceilings of their rooms so they could still read even if they were immobile. She developed kind of the early talking book programs for folks with vision disabilities. And as you can see here, she really understood the power of reading in community. So she developed a newspaper reading club and a book club where people would give book reports on different books. But the thing that's really important here in thinking about identity is the space that's in front of us in this photograph. This is the main library in the hospital that she curated. And as you can see on the walls, there's photos of elite African Americans in American history. And all of the books, she tried to stock as many books as she could by Black authors, writing empowering stories about Black lives. And I think that this issue of representation is one that we still talk about and are grappling with, but it's so empowering to be able to be exposed to books that present positive reflections of your own various histories and identities. And she understood this, and this is her main innovation as a bibliotherapist. She said of many soldiers, they found themselves in the library. And in many ways, this was the way that they did that, through just being exposed to books that would offer points of inspiration, maybe those kismet moments of identity and reflection. She also, I should note, was one of the first people other than AA to develop a program for alcoholics to use reading and community reading and support to treat alcoholism. So she really was a hugely innovative person, and I hope somebody will write a biography about her someday. There's a modern conduit to this work with veterans, and it's the Veterans Reading Homer Project, which is in New Hampshire. And this is a project that's started by a classics professor, and she invites veterans of any conflict, any age, to come together and read the Odyssey and the Iliad together as a group to process a story about a warrior's return home and sort of living with the trauma of that and navigating re-entry into civilian life. This is a really interesting program, and it's been really moving and powerful for the veterans who have taken part in it, especially when you consider not a lot of folks get exposed to these books in school or have positive memories of those experiences. But so to kind of re-enter society and re-engage a book maybe you read as an assignment offers this kind of positive reflection on your own identity and experience to process various experiences. This is also a kind of approach that we see in schools. So in Westborough High School, Massachusetts, there's a group wellness reading group that's run by guidance counselors. And they have everyone read a book in common, like Please Ignore Vera Dietz. And in this book, the main character is dealing with trauma in her own family history and shame around that. And that's something that a lot of the students can relate to. And without necessarily disclosing their personal situation, they can use the events and characters of the book as a kind of language for their own experience. And that's a really powerful means of practicing bibliotherapy. For folks who are here who are parents, it's a way to kind of have conversations with your kids about things that maybe they don't want to discuss using their own experience. Having books kind of stand in as a safe space is something that can be really powerful. There's a historical example of a woman who was widowed and whose child had died from an illness in the 1920s, and she was brought to a mental hospital because she could not speak. She was so traumatized, and she had a younger child who was taken away from her because she could not care for them in that moment. And the doctor, she wouldn't speak and no one knew what to do for her. And the doctor prescribed the book Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. And for those who have not read it, I'm about to spoil a major plot point, but one of the daughters in the book, there's 4 sisters, dies of, I think, scarlet fever. And he said, call me when she reaches the scene where Beth dies. And sure enough, when Beth died, he comes to her and she's crying and she says, this is just what happened to my daughter. So she's able to use the language of this book and these experiences of fictional characters as a way into talking about her own experiences. So that was in the 1920s, and this book group is happening today. And maybe you have experiences in your own life that have allowed you to kind of retreat into a book to kind of rediscover some things about yourself. This is a really great example of some bibliotherapy work happening today on issues of identity and representation. And I've put the information of this therapist here and a link to the direct TikTok, which I'll briefly describe, in which this therapist says that she actually uses children's books with some of her adult patients, specifically people of color who may not have grown up with children's books that reflect people like them. So people specifically who were in the 80s. So by offer greater representation, it kind of invites folks to process kind of a lot of their own shame around this and kind of do what she calls inner child work. So it's a really interesting example in the book that she describes in the TikTok is this edition of Alice in Wonderland. I also just want to briefly touch on the fact that not all bibliotherapy is about reading. Some of it's about making and sort of the wellness that comes with focusing on what's in front of you. And instead of maybe focusing on a math textbook and completing a problem, you might actually want to make something. There's a whole history of writing as a form of therapy. And so something like zines or homemade magazines offers both the opportunity to share something of yourself in writing, and then also for someone else to kind of benefit from reading your own experience. There's a really great project here that I've linked called Quarantine Public Library, where artists were invited to make a homemade zine about their experience of COVID or really any topic. And you can go on this site and you can print any of them for free. There's also a great tutorial on how to make a zine. So if you're new to it, never heard of it, you should give it a try. It's a lot of fun and it can have a really powerful kind of mindfulness effect. Similarly, there's an Instagram campaign called Are You Book Enough for people who like to make books. And they had every month they have a different prompt. In one month it was heal. And if you click on this link here, you can actually see a lot of the books folks made just inspired by imagining books as medicine. And so there's a lot of great interpretations of that concept. But just to say, there's many different ways of practicing bibliotherapy. Some of it has a kind of occupational therapy approach, and that itself has a long history of bookmaking as a kind of occupational therapy. So these are things that might be beneficial for folks here. I also just want to offer a cautionary tale. I know like we're living in a very rough time when, the news often doesn't have a lot of good news. And yet our brains are trained by algorithms to seek out even more bad news through doom scrolling. So if you're not familiar with that term, there's a brief definition, but how many of us have gone to bed at night or sat down to relax at the end of the day and you can't help but keep scrolling through Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, even though you're not feeling calm with what you're seeing, you keep engaging it. And in part, that's because our brains are tricked to continue to seek out things to which we have an emotional response, good, bad, and different. And algorithms actually play on that. So that's why doom scrolling has become even more of a problem and something of a diagnosis in its own right during the pandemic. But I just want to kind of acknowledge it as a kind of reading that actually can harm in many cases. And I've shared an article here on how to basically try to mitigate that and practice some wellness around it. In some cases, it's to consciously put a timer on your phone when you're going to go on social media so that you can kind of have a natural endpoint, or to keep things on your phone that take you to a positive emotional reaction so you can kind of pull yourself out of it. And in this, there's also an Amanda Hess article, which is also not bibliotherapy. It's a little bit depressing, but it's about how climate change is actually not helped by doom scrolling. So there's something about us, we can see climate change evidence on social media and we like the post about it. And there's something about this effect that makes us think that that we've done enough there. So it's kind of an interesting reflection on the limits of bibliotherapy in some case to cause us to be active in response to the things that might cause anxiety or stress. I do want to also note that even though doom scrolling is not bibliotherapy, there are some of us who actually find comfort in reading dystopian books in these what feel sometimes like dystopian times. Now, I am not one of those people, so I'm often very curious about why that might be or what folks are getting from it. And there's some really great writing out there by psychologists who study this. And essentially, people like Elizabeth Cohen and others might say, dystopian novels like Station 11, which is a wonderful book, allow us a really safe space to experiment with difficult emotions. So you can read the book and sort of see how a dystopian world would feel like, and kind of practice how your own emotional response to it within the safe confines of the book. Some folks also find positive feelings in reading a dystopian book or a kind of true crime novel set in a real past, because they want to see how other people dealt with feelings that seem to resemble feelings that they're having. So this is why there's been a rise in true crime, even TV shows and books during the pandemic. It seems counterintuitive, and yet some folks feel comforted or affirmed by watching how people in the past solved a crime or found some resolution there. There's also a sense of community if you read a dystopian book at times. And how do people find joy? For example, in the book of Station 11, they're producing Shakespeare adaptations after some major kind of dystopian events. So the fact that people can still find joy in that world in some ways inspires us to think we might still find joy in our own world and lives, especially at tough times like the peak time of the pandemic. I also just want to note that bibliotherapy can also be used to disrupt. So it's not just something we should use to self-soothe. It can be something we use to disrupt our own assumptions, or try to kind of create community conversations around important topics. With the murder of George Floyd and other events, anti-racism reading lists have popped up on a lot of public library sites and been important kind of sources of dialogue. I know you have a really strong social justice program here at the Bloomfield Public Library, so I'm sure you're already doing this work. But this can be this idea that bibliotherapy shouldn't just heal you in a kind of passive way, but inspire you to act or react or disrupt can also be, I think, an important way to think about that. Lastly, I just want to note one of my favorite cases of bibliotherapy during the pandemic, which was kind of draw people into community. So Dolly Parton, who I'm a big fan of, actually drew on the self-help book, Little Engine That Could, as the first book in a YouTube series she started to read children's books on YouTube. And it kind of brought people together in a kind of virtual community, not unlike what we're doing right now. And there's actually a lot of examples of this during the pandemic, including Tolstoy Together, which was a group project on the site of Public Space, where people read Tolstoy's War and Peace in small doses and then would come together and talk about it online. Or this project, Co-Reading Virus, in which Robert McFarland reread Nan Shepherd's Living Mountain, which is a memoir of kind of like walking in the Scottish Highlands, and people reacted to it on Twitter and were reading it with him. Folks who lived in Scotland actually went to places mentioned in the book and posted photos from it. So there's a lot of attempts, I think, in our world right now to kind of seek out community, even as COVID has really increased kind of the social isolation some have felt even before. So this kind of takes me to our own modern like moment in bibliotherapy. So I just want to acknowledge, I know I talked about things that, you know, might take you down like a dystopian novel or what have you. But what I really hope that we take from this conversation is that there's many different ways to find healing through reading, not just books, but whatever genre appeals to you. And I'd really be curious to hear your own reflections on your life as a reader and what books really inspire you. So thanks very much. And I look forward to hearing your questions or thoughts.